Duke of Westminster. And if he gives somebody a lease on one of these, then one of the conditions of the lease is that they paint the house in the same cream colour. Mrs. Thatcher used to live just over here on the left-hand side until she died just recently. She had one of the houses around the corner here. And a little ways up to our right was Julie Garland's house. And another guy who lived here in the swinging 60s, very much part of the scene. He used to live just up on the next street on the right, was Ronan Polanski. Anybody remember, he's still here, Eaton Terrace. Does anybody remember Ronan Polanski's wife's name? No?
No.
How about Sharon Tate? Ah, murdered by Charlie Manson. And actually, it was while that murder took place and Ronan Polanski took the terrible telephone call to tell him what had happened, he was actually in London, here taking the call. He was at their flat. So this brings us down now into Chelsea. A little song from Elvis Costello here. Who doesn't like Chelsea? Elvis Costello's real name, by the way, is Declan McManus. I think he probably not sold quite as many records with a name like that as Elvis Costello. Well, he doesn't like Chelsea, as he sings here. I don't like Chelsea, because this is a very, very upscale suburb, and young Declan is from an adjoining suburb that's a little bit more down market. Chelsea is, you know, one of the tops of the social tree, and you'll see this is called Sloane Square here, which is one of the prime locations. On the left-hand side, you'll see the Royal Court Theatre. This is one of the fringe theatres, and that is where the Rocky Horror Show started. It did 6 weeks performance before it outgrew itself and had to move to a larger theatre. The hotel over on the right-hand side, the Sloane Square Hotel, that's where the Beatles stayed the first night they came down to London to make their album Please Please Me. And so if you go on the internet again and you type in Sloane Square Beatles, Royal Court Beatles, you'll come up with photographs of them, very young men, publicity photographs taken round in this area. I do feel sorry for a lot of the people that we see walking around today, because they've come for the Chelsea Flower Show. And this is hardly ideal weather for a bit of gardening, isn't it? But I'm glad to see that most of them are totally ignoring the Beatles' message of when the rain comes, you run and hide your heads. They're all still out. And no doubt even this Chelsea street we're going to go down, King's Road, will be as busy as ever. And what you can see, on either side now going down, the site's all the way down. This is a very famous shopping street. Lots of good fashion shops mostly at this end. George Harrison used to have an apartment just here on the right-hand side, second one in. You know, what happened was once these guys got some money and they moved down from Liverpool, they wanted to be in with the cut and thrust here. They wanted to be where it was all happening. And this was where swinging 60s London was happening. So I'm going to pass around some laminates as we're driving down. And this one you can see is the front cover of Time magazine from 1966, when they christened this swinging London, and this very much part here, the swinging scene. Out on the left-hand side, you see a nice little piazza. Not looking so nice in this weather, but generally a nice little piazza, and that's the view Ringo gets from his apartment, because Ringo still keeps an apartment here on the King's Road, and it's just down here on the left-hand side. And we'll often see Ringo coming out in his car here, or maybe walking up to Harrods, which is over our right-hand side a little bit. And you know, not so long ago, Ringo went into Harrods, went to buy something, and he presented his credit card with his real name on it. Anybody remember his real name? Ringo's proper name? No? Richard Starkey. And the young girl behind the counter refused to take his card because he didn't have proof of identity with him. And Ringo was thrilled to bits. Seriously, because it was the first time in 40 years he hadn't been recognised. Now, lots of these places down here have kind of changed their names, but the function of them, or the buildings themselves, are exactly the same. So, coming up on the left-hand side again, you're going to see McDonald's. And this has a very interesting history, because 35, 40 years ago, coming down here, the drug wasn't hamburgers people were after. And when Jago couldn't always get what he wanted, you can't always get what you want. He sings about coming to the Chelsea pharmacy, and this was it. Where McDonald's was the great hippie hangout. And it was also the Milky Bar in Clockwork Orange, if any of you have ever seen that film. Yeah, that was where Alex and the Droogs all met. You know, the amount of people and the amount of things that's gone on down this street is absolutely astounding. And bands who want to make it, doesn't matter where they're from in the world, they have to come to London. If you can make it in London, you're going to be a world success. And I'll give you one illustration of this. If I said to you, American music, Californian music, what bands would sum it up? I don't think it'd be long before you said the Eagles. And if I said, well, what particular Eagles track is really, really America? I don't think it'd be too long before we came up with Hotel California. Agreed?
Yes.
It was written on this road. And the Eagles' first 2 albums were recorded in London while they had a flat here on the King's Road. So this is kind of the epicentre of it all happening. The Beatles actually opened a shop down here. They had a little tailoring shop, Apple Tailoring. Not the Apple Boutique, not the famous boutique, but a little tailoring shop. Now that's been pulled down. That was just here where the French Connection now is. Now, on the right-hand side, if we can give the windows a bit of a polish, I'm sure you will want to see, if not take photographs, of a building here on the right called the Pheasantry. You can see it just before the red bus comes up. You're going to get your photographs here. Shoot them out through the open window. Quick, before the bus comes. Got it? Quick, quick. Yep. Oh, just in time. Just in time. A snatch shot. Now, that building, when it was first opened, it actually was a pheasantry, a farm for breeding the King's pheasants. This was the King's Road, and only the King was allowed to go down here at the time. By 1900, this had turned into a ballet school. A very famous ballet teacher, Daguerre, was here. By the 1950s, this had become a very select dining room restaurant. You had to pay £500 to be a member. Can you imagine how much that was in the 60s? So people like Humphrey Bogart, Lauren Bacall, this sort of statue of style were members and would come here. Then in the 60s, hippies, or at least the more swinging set, started moving in. Now Australians, you can start being a little proud here, because you probably don't realise how much impact there was of Australians coming into London in the 60s in the whole rock and roll world. And 2 lads who came in were most notable for starting up a magazine called Oz, which was a counterculture magazine. I'll hand this round and you'll see actually the drawings you look at today, well, you think, yeah, well, okay, so what? But in the mid-1960s, these were absolutely revolutionary, both in colour and in content, because they were considered to be pornographic, and the thing was also considered to be political. So Oz was always getting busted, and we had a famous obscenity trial in the mid-60s that actually changed the laws in Britain over this magazine. And the 2 guys did it, called Richard Neville and Martin Sharp. So we'll pass this one around and have a look. There's just some front covers on that. Martin Sharp is best known for the Hendrix Sunburst poster, which I think everybody will recognise, one of the great bits of hippie art of the 60s. Again, you look at it now, you've got to remember, this was absolutely revolutionary. Remember, in 1966, when this was made, we didn't even have colour television. So this was a real riot, an explosion of colour into our lives. in I should say, a post-war London, because we were only 20 years after the end of the Second War. How many people here can remember back 20 years? Pretty much all of us, and it's vivid. So think 1967, everybody was still remembering the war years, so this whole rock and roll thing really hit them hard. Living next door to Martin Sharp was a certain Eric Clapton. And Clapton liked this artwork, and he said, Martin, you couldn't do an album cover for us, could you? So, if I've got any Cream fans on board, Clapton fans on board, does anybody own this album? This is called Disraeli Gears, and this is one of Cream's great albums, and this was designed in that building, and a lot of the photography that's on the back of this, actually, on the original album, is photographs of Chelsea itself. Let's pass it back, just have a look. Just again, the younger ones amongst you, just look at the artwork, because this was real hippie artwork of the period. Another person, Australian, who lived in there, Germaine Greer. Yeah, the female eunuch. Yep. You know, the super groupie. You know, if she ever wrote her memoirs, it wouldn't be a kiss and tell, it would be a shag and shout. Eh? The band Queen. Somebody was asking for a few Queen sites. That's where Queen were discovered, because there's a little basement club. And in 1970, Queen were playing in the club, and they were picked up by the guys from Trident Studio. So, you know, there's still a music venue in the basement now. And as you can see, it's a pizza land or a Pizza Hut now. So it's really tracked a downward course since those heady days of the 60s. This whole street you see down here attracted everybody who wanted to see or be seen.
Seek him here, they seek him there. His clothes are loud, but never square. It will make or break him, so he's got to buy the best, 'cause he's a
or at the back, sing.
Fashion. And when he does his little round.
Who remembers who this song was by? No? The Kinks. Dedicated follower of fashion. And it's all about the sort of the trendies who would come down onto the King's Road here. Now, I've got a little question for you guys, and especially as we've got a couple of Spanish speakers on board today. There's a shoe shop, look, on the left-hand side here. Now, either the Spanish speakers or the English speakers will be able to answer this question for me. You see this rather lovely shoe shop, look here. We'll have a look at it. He's probably giving us a wave. There we are. Now, what I want to know, is this shoe shop owned... Hooray! Is this shoe shop owned by a Spanish man called Arsoles, or is it just the shoes are no good? Coming up on the left-hand side down here again, we've got one of the better-known pubs of the area. This is the Chelsea Potter, unchanged in design since the 60s, and this was a pub that all the guys would come hang out at. Jim Morrison of the Doors famously got so drunk in here, he didn't nearly make the one gig they ever played in England. Totally underestimated the strength of English beer. For every memoir you read of these guys, you read of them meeting up in this pub. This street down here on the left-hand side, I'm not going to go right down to the house today. In the rain, the traffic gets so bad here, it gets very slow, so I won't go down to the bottom of the house, but down the bottom of this street, this is for you Latin Americans, this is where Caetano Veloso and Gilberto Gil lived. They had their exiles apartment at the bottom. For those of you who don't know these characters, write them down in your notes, especially Gilberto Gil, G-I-L, because when Gilberto Gil and Caetano Veloso came here from Brazil, 1969, they were fleeing the military government. So they were rebels, and for 3 years they were here in London. They influenced rock music quite a lot by bringing Latin rhythms into the music, and similarly when they went back, they took rock music back to Latin America with them, especially reggae, which we'll see why later. And in the last but one Brazilian government, Gilberto Gil was no longer a rebel, he was the Minister of Culture. It just shows once again how all over the world rock music has gone from rebellion to style. Coming up on the left-hand side, you'll see the Jaeger building coming up. Now, of course, that really high-class fashion, but in the mid-1960s, it was an art studio. And a pop artist, as they were called in those days, had this premise. He was called Peter Blake. Anybody know the relationship of Peter Blake and the Beatles? Has everybody got Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band? And can you picture the front cover on Sgt. Pepper's? I didn't bring it with me because it's normally so well known, I don't have to tell people. But the Sgt. Pepper cover has the Beatles looking over what appears to be a grave, and they have some 65 other famous people all around them, either as waxworks or photographs. It's a very iconic album cover, and this is where it was made, in this building. This same street, Flood Street, had Eric Clapton's house at one time was down here, and his next door neighbour in 1978, when he lived here, was Mrs. Margaret Thatcher. Can you imagine Thatcher living next door to Clapton? Eh? The Iron Lady rather than Iron Maiden.
Excuse me,
Also down here on the left-hand side, you're going past the Proud Galleries, where you'll see some nice shots of Bowie in the window, but also the Café de la Paille. You see the little cafe here on our left-hand side. Now, I'll tell you a story of that in a second. Coming up on the left also is the Chelsea Town Hall. And you can see here, look, weddings have obviously been taking place this morning with all the confetti and whatever down here. That's where Ronan Polanski married Sharon Tate. This is where Judy Garland married her fourth husband, who was an Englishman. And it's a sad story too, you know. Judy Garland, she was very much part of this swinging 60s setup. When she came to do a wedding here, she was warned by her friends, don't marry this character. He was a bisexual gambler with known gangster connections. Anyway, she went ahead with it. There was going to be a fourth marriage. She sent invitations out to 150 A-list celebrities, and only 50 came to the wedding. Everybody else boycotted it, including Liza Minnelli, her own daughter. But Lisa at least sent a wedding card with the message, good luck, Mum, I'll come to the next one. 3 months later, Liza Minnelli choked to death in her flat here in Chelsea. One young lady who had a very lucky escape here was a pop musician called Chrissie Hynde. And Chrissie Hynde is in a famous band called the Pretenders, very popular in the 80s. A great friend of Linda McCartney's, and she's an American lass, and when she was living here in the 70s, her visa ran out, and she thought she was going to get thrown out of the country, and then she thought, well, the only way I can get a visa is if I marry an Englishman. So there were some young men in the social set, and she persuaded one of them to marry her, and they arranged it for the Chelsea Registry Office. And on the appointed day, Chrissie was standing on the steps waiting for him, and she waited, and she waited, and she waited, and she was the jilted bride. The rascal didn't turn up, which was probably a lucky escape, or she would have been Mrs. Sid Vicious. Yeah. This is the more popular end now of the King's Road. You can see that it's getting a little narrower, and the sort of shops we have are a bit more funky down here. Design shops and art shops and whatever. And you'll see in a minute, if you do come back for a stroll down here, and this is a nice street to just come walk down and look at the shops. You can walk down as far as this, and you can pop in to the Stock Pot, which is coming up on our left hand side. And the Stock Pot would not only be the cheapest place you could have a bite to eat and a coffee, very traditional old cafe here, look on the left hand side, but at the back of the Stock Pot there, they have 3 Beatles silver discs on the walls, because it was a place the Beatles used to use when they would come down to the photographic studios here.
Excuse me, Barry.
Yeah.
How long till we get back to Abbey Road? Because my family texted me and I want to watch the...
Put about 4:30, say about 4:30.
Okay, thank you.
Now, this street, I could come down any street in Chelsea and find you celebrity houses. This is an interesting one because we've got a whole collection of them down here, including, I'd say, the people who live on the left-hand side, though they're kind of unknown celebrities. Because this house was the first house built on the King's Road in 1720. The garden, there's only one larger garden in central London, and that's Buckingham Palace. I wonder how much this would be worth. It's the original family still own it, that house. So, I'm like I say, I'm frightened to even begin to think of how much it would cost. On the left-hand side, coming up, you see a nice Ferrari parked in a drive here, look. And the yellow house and the brick house behind it. That was a recording studio, a little recording studio in the 60s called Sound Techniques, a little 4-track recording studio, and that's where Pink Floyd did their first two singles inside that building. And it's a very sad story, you know, Pink Floyd's, because they had a singer called Syd Barrett, and unfortunately Syd Barrett discovered LSD, acid. And in the 3 months between them making the first single and the second single in this building corresponded with him discovering this LSD. And by the time he came back to do the second one, in 3 months he had managed to literally fry his brain on these drugs. And he didn't even recognise his best friend, Gabe Gilmore, who came in to see him here. So, the dark side of the 60s. You'll know Jethro Tull?
Yeah.
This is where they made their first album. And Nick Drake, and Fairport Attraction, Fairport Convention, and Incredible String Band, and a lot of the sort of folk rockers made their music inside that place. On the number 44, if you're taking a quick shot, if you're into Def Leppard, number 44 was where the guitarist of Def Leppard drank himself to death. And his parents then kept the building for 10 years like a mausoleum. So when they opened it, we thought it'd be good. It'd be like a time capsule, but unfortunately we weren't privy to looking inside. On the right-hand side, this pub we have, now called the Pig's Ear. This used to be called the Front Page, and all the bands, of course, going in the studio would come into the pub here. Now it's owned by the footballer Frank Lampard of Chelsea. On the left-hand side, number 36A, the black doors there, that's Eric Clapton's London home. That's where he lives today. And we often see Clapton wandering around, and also in this pub you will see the lead singer of AC/DC. Not Bron Scott, that's for sure. But no, the current singer, Brian Johnson, he drinks in this pub because he lives in that street as well. And also the Formula One racer, Jenson Buttons, lives there. So these are very select houses, as you can see down here. Look, very smart, very beautiful properties. And if you fancy living down here, guys, you can have one of these if you like. I think about £12 million would probably get you one of these in this area. Because, again, on the right-hand side, you guys look out, you'll just about see, on the other side of the road, you'll see yellow awnings. Can you all make out the yellow awnings? And there's a black one just before the yellow ones. That's London's most exclusive light club. That's where Kate and William go, and Harry goes when they want a bit of privacy. So you can imagine a not easy place to get into. You know, last year I was driving down here with a Brazilian group, a tourist group, and as we came down here, the one gentleman next to me was getting more and more excited, and I ended up pulling up just here at the traffic lights opposite this noodle bar here on the left. And he was getting very excited because he'd seen all these Clapton sites and Cream sites. And as I pulled up outside there at the traffic lights, he was sitting in your seat here, he suddenly went, "Huh, huh, huh," and jumped out of the car. I thought, my God, he's having a heart attack. No, he'd seen Eric Clapton having his lunch in that noodle bar, and he was out with his camera trying to take photographs of him. Clapton was waving him away with one hand, and I was busy trying to crawl under my seat. Now, on the right-hand side here, guys, this is arguably the second most important rock site in London after Abbey Road. You see the clock? Normally that clock is spinning backwards. I think the battery must have run out today. But that boutique is still owned by the same people who originally owned it. And they were called Malcolm McLaren and Vivian Westwood. At first it was called Let It Rock. Then it was called Too Old to Rock and Roll, Too Young to Die. And then they changed the name to Sex. And that's how the boutique used to look back in the mid-70s. And Malcolm McLaren decided that he'd sell some interesting clothing. You pass it back, he'd sell bondage clothing. And then he thought, you know what, it'd be a good idea to set a band up to sell this clothing with music. So he had a young band inside called the Swankers. One of the boys was in this band called the Swankers. He said, we have to change you a little bit from that, new singer. So they saw a young boy walking along the road here on the left-hand side with a t-shirt on, a Pink Floyd t-shirt. And this young lad had written in paint over it, I hate Pink Floyd. Because these are kind of the young men coming up at the end of the 70s. Pink Floyd was the music of their elder brothers. It was boring, it was 20 minutes long, you know, it wasn't their music, they wanted some different music. So they said to this lad, can you sing? They took him inside, put a jukebox on, had him sing along to Alice Cooper, who wanted an Alice Cooper connection. Sing along to Alice Cooper, and school's out for summer. Couldn't sing, but the boss said, Malcolm McLaren said, well, I like your attitude, what's your name? He said, Johnny Lydon. Oh, right, okay. Well, with teeth like yours, we'll call you Johnny Rotten. So this is the birthplace of the Sex Pistols. And also, then, Susie and the Banshees, The Clash, Adam and the Ants, Billy Idol and Generation X. They all really came out of this building. Chrissie Hynde herself, of the Pretenders, she was actually a serving girl inside the boutique. So, I mean, punk music is a noisy, cacophonous sound, but it was very important in kind of dragging rock and roll back to where it really perhaps belongs, and that's live and allowing people to jump up and down. The older group at the back are saying, oh, thank God we're not going to get any more of that. One thing you can say about the punk bands, they were not great musicians, but it was brilliant to go out to listen to and enjoy, you see, as a dance. It was real good young people's music. Now, the irony was that the punks hated long-haired bands. And yet, 100 metres from the headquarters of punk, you had the headquarters of long hair. Because over here on the right-hand side, just where this van is parked now, I'll go slowly past it perhaps so you can get a shot and take it out the front window, but that was the headquarters of Led Zeppelin and their Swan Song record label. I bet nobody can tell me who was on Swan Song apart from Led Zeppelin, can they? No? Do you remember Bad Company?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Do you remember the Pretty Things I've talked about? The Flaming Groovies? People perhaps much remember? Who remembers Dave Edmunds' Rock Pile? I hear you knocking, but you can't come in. Yeah. Huh? Yeah. Where was Dave Edmunds from? Wales! So, right-hand side, this was 484 was the Zeppelin's office. And next door here, where it's now the Italian Chandelier shop, that was the most famous hippie boutique. That was Granny Takes a Trip. All the bands would come down to take a trip with Granny's and to buy clothes and stage gear. Here on the right-hand side, look, Paddy Powers, bookmakers. That was a pub called the Weatherby Arms. And in early 1962, Keith Richards, Mick Jagger and Brian Jones auditioned Bill Wyman for the Rolling Stones in that pub. And Bill Wyman came in a taxi, because remember, none of these boys could drive, but none of them had cars. 1962, not many people had their own cars. And these lads had never even taken the driving tests. In fact, most of them were earning £1 million before they could drive. Anyway, Bill Wyman pitched up in his taxi, he gets out, and three boys look at each other, nah, too old. And then his PA and all his equipment followed him. And they hadn't got any equipment. So all of a sudden, he was old enough. And the Rolling Stones were kind of on the road. Now, why did they do the pub there? Well, because here at number 102, the middle floor flat, this is Edith Grove. This is where the Stones were born. In the winter of 1961 and 1962, Brian Jones had this flat, the middle flat upstairs there at 102, and he invited Mick Jagger and Keith Richards to come share the flat and pay the rent, basically. And then over the winter of 61-62, they kind of sat in there the complete winter and learnt how to play the music of Chuck Berry and Jimmy Reed and Muddy Waters. And by the middle of 62, say they were recruiting their bass player, and then they found Charlie Watts later in the year, and the Rolling Stones were born. So this really is the birthplace of the Stones. And when they were here, of course, they'd have parties. Beatles came to parties here, outrageous parties. Eventually, the landlord decided to throw them out. And the final straw was Mick Jagger pissing on people out of the window down below. I'm sorry, Sir Michael Jagger peeing on people. The Stones were on the road. The Stones were rolling. Now, Clash fans on the left-hand side. By the way, this is Bad Company I'm playing about. Enough for you, love. On the left-hand side here, this block of apartments was where Joe Strummer was living when he wrote London Calling. And he would travel from here up to the other side of London on the bus. Again, a young man with no car, no transport. And when you hear him singing on London Calling, there's a famous line where he sings, "I'm living down by the river." Well, you can see why he wrote that, because he was living down by the river. And this is lovely down here. Look, what a shame the weather's so poor and you can't really see it, because this is the Embankment, and it's a beautiful part of London down here. You see all the houseboats. Would you like to live on one of these houseboats? £1 million. £150,000 a year in mooring fees. But back in the 60s, we had a few rockers living on them. Lemmy from Motorhead, for example, was on one of these. And right over the other side there, in block of flats, just looking back to your left there, you can see the high-rise flat with all the glass. That's where Michael Caine lives. You all know Michael Caine? Yeah, not a lot of people know that, though. Down here to the left, just behind us, is where Bryan Adams, the Canadian rocker, lives, down that street. And, okay, we're lucky today. Look, I'm going to pull over. At least there's one thing we can do in the rain. You can get a photograph of a very unusual pair of cars with their registrations. Look at the registrations of these cars in front here. To be and not to be. Now, just to explain, those cars are probably worth, well, I can't even begin to tell you how much they're worth. Because the cars themselves are great cars, but the registration plates in England, you can't ask the government for those numbers. Those registration plates have just been generated by computer. In fact, 2BE is probably a car from the 1920s, because it will have been one of the original registration numbers. And if you want a personalised plate, you can't just write and say, I want a personalised plate. You have to find who owns the registration and buy it off them, including the car. And then you scrap the car it was on and transfer it onto your car. And when there are registrations like that, people will charge 50, 60, £100,000 just for the registration number. So those two cars together, like that, I reckon you're looking at probably £500,000 worth of registration plates there.